Morning, everybody. How we doing today? Hope you're having a jazzy week. It's a chilly morning here in upper Minnesota. And we're in the southeastern corner of the state, where actually the weather is quite milder compared to the northwestern part of the state. But it's still, chilly, brisk morning here, probably high 40s, low 50s. What's that in Celsius nowadays? 11, 12 degrees. I was raised in Canada and around Celsius. I've been in the U.S. so long now that I get a few cross references with Celsius and Fahrenheit, like 30 degrees and 100 degrees are pretty close, and 40 below and 40 below are both pretty close, and of course 0 and 32. But I mean, some of that gradients in between Celsius 0 and Celsius 30. I mean, 20 is a pretty nice day, right? 17's like in the 70s, 80s, I think 70s. But yeah, it's funny how that stuff kind of slips. Kind of like learning French. I learned French as a kid, but I can barely say je ne sais quoi now. Like it's become a pretty foreign language here to me in the U.S. So some fun things I want to share with you today. We'll get back on that Hidden Treasures, Hidden Classics series. I mean, there's a pretty infinite supply of records that I would consider hidden classics that are kind of outside of the realm of the reissue programs and the hype circles on the internet today. And hopefully we can help promote some of those albums. And I mean, it's too bad that an album or a cool record that no one knows about, that episode will get half the views of an episode about a John Coltrane record that everybody knows something about. But I guess those are the diehards, those are the real collectors in my mind in some ways, not just the people collecting surface reissues that are kind of the nominal obvious choices in the canon and have been repackaged infinitely over the years. And really, an album like Blue Train is really not that hard to find. I mean, it's been repressed and repackaged so many times. This new phone I got last January gets updates all the time, and it just always adds little features that I find annoying. Now when I make a video, the screen wants to go black after a minute, and then does it again after like the 3-minute, 4-minute mark. It's kind of annoying. But again, that whole reverse image thing I've been dealing with at times, that's a thing that's something a glitch in my phone programming. And it's not something I can fix or do anything about. I've been on some of the Samsung chat rooms, and it's something that's just part of this phone's systems. I try to remember to reverse it in editing, and sometimes it doesn't even do it. Sometimes it just films it normally, so it's a bit mysterious to me, to say the least. First thing I want to talk about today is small label Esoteric out of New York. I don't think they had a very long run. I think there's a Charlie Christian recording on there that's fairly collectible. But these two records are at number 2 and number 3 on the label. And there's not much beyond this, I don't think. I think maybe another release or two. But I found this one in Chicago a couple months back. You remember me talking about that Chicago trip. Found it in a little store on the far north side of the city. Great little Rattleback Records, I think it was called. Rattleback. Great little store. Very helpful staff. Really enjoyed being there. Great selection, honestly. And probably not one that's picked over for jazz quite the same way as the Chicago inner city, downtown area, north side record stores. This was volume 2. I found it on Discogs. Wasn't super expensive, but I do feel like these are pretty rare records. The cool thing is my friend Jean-Michel Reeser, also known as Beethoven, called that by Ray Brown. Jean-Michel posted a picture to me the other day of his father's version of these 2 10-inches on an American label, which I think is the name of the label. It's actually like a French label, that his father bought these 2 albums on 1 LP in the early 60s. And I've never seen that record before that I can recall. I have seen that label a few times. Again, I think the label is American Record or something like that. Again, I think it's a French label, though. Great stuff. Not the same band on this one. Features the great Roy Eldridge, one of the fieriest trumpet players on a real bridge between Armstrong and Dizzy Gillespie. The great Flip Phillips on the sax, Eddie Safransky's on the bass, Al Casey's on the guitar. Big Al Casey guy. He really shines on this session. Specs Powell's on the drums on part of it, Mike Colicchio, and then Mel Torme does some scatting, and then he plays drums on a couple numbers. And people forget that Mel Torme was a fine drummer. So these are pretty cool pieces. They sound great. They're from 1947, and yeah, both of them, WNEW, on the air, Esoteric Volume 1 and 2. great drawings, reminiscent of some David Stone Martin, maybe a little bit of Burt Goldblatt even. It's a great time for design, for graphic design, and jazz was at the forefront of graphic design in the early 50s, being one of the most important parts of the music industry, even though that was waning. Jazz certainly led the rush to change album and cover design going into the 10-inch era, obviously into the LP era. Sadly, by the late 60s, into the 70s, 80s, and 90s, jazz suffers from some of the worst graphic design, being reduced to small niche of most of the record companies. There was no budget to put graphic design and great photography. It was often really banal photography with generic fonts, and just they look so bad to me. Of course, CTI was the real exception in the 70s. I think a lot of the ECM covers are just as boring as the music inside them. Just sterile. I mean, they look so vacuous. The covers are just these... Again, it's just my taste. So, great session, and I think that's probably Mel Torme right there. Fun stuff, you know, and featuring a lot of the great talent of that era. So enough on the esoteric records. Fun. A little scat going on. So a record I got from Carolina Soul, I think it was. Tenor Sax Stylings, Volume 3, played by Joe Flip Phillips again. And again, a great player from that era that's largely forgotten today. Does it list the band here? Oh, no, those are other 12 inches. But it's, again, a great player on the Brunswick label out of New Jersey. And Brunswick does some pretty good jazz for 5 years or so. And then they branch off more into soul with like the Shy Lights and another great soul singer, what's his name? But it became much more of a soul R&B record label, like Atlantic and like a lot of other labels that were trying to stay afloat. If you stay jazz from that era, you were probably going to not exist for long. You know, not many of the jazz labels from the 50s have any longevity into the 60s and 70s. Prestige and Verve probably have the best continuing legacy into the 70s. And of course, by the 80s and 90s, even Verve is a part of a much larger branch of the music industry and is kind of not an entity on its own in any way, shape, or form. It was just where they put jazzy releases. So none of the great jazz labels from the 50s, the Blue Notes, the Contemporary stayed around quite a long time, actually. Pacific, Riverside, most of these labels, Bethlehem, Savoy, a lot of jazz labels had a very short shelf life. Esoteric being one of the smaller ones. And again, Brunswick survived longer because they diversified, which makes sense. This is another Red Norvo 10-inch. One of the great bebop vibraphonists. He was a very influential player. He played with Parker, if I recall, at times. A character he's playing with Teddy Wilson here. Slam Stewart, the great bass player, who would hum along with his bass playing, often creating chords with his sound. Aaron Sachs is on the clarinet, who's a great player. I'm trying to remember the big band he played with. Was it Goodman? He played with a big band for a while, but he also has some stuff on Bethlehem that's really outstanding. Eddie Dell's on the drums, and then Remo Palmieri's on the guitar. So it's a nice little session. And again, Teddy Wilson was a fantastic player in his own right. Again, Benny Goodman kind of helped bring him to the fore. So fun little record on the Emersy label. This was Emersy number 25062. Emersy has a pretty good 10-inch discography. A lot of it does get repackaged on the LP 36,000 series. And whether or not this was repackaged, I can't remember if Red Norvo has an Emersy LP or not. If they do, chances are it's from these 10 inches, because Emersy does a lot of that repackaging. Then a Vanguard release I found, Sir Charles Thompson. Again, a guy who has Parker pedigree, was a big part of the early days of bebop, but has a deeper roots and boogie woogie in the blues and even some of the swing. But Sir Charles Thompson, who I could be good corrected, but it was either Sweet Edison or maybe Lester Young, gave him the name Sir Charles Thompson, who was named after a famous British naval officer, if my memory serves. It's been a while since I saw that information, but he's a British officer, I'm pretty sure naval, that was Sir Charles Thompson, and I think from 100 years ago. Now, not concurrently. And when Charles Thompson kind of starts becoming a name in the jazz circles, I think it was Lester Young started calling him Sir Charles Thompson as an echo on that great naval officer that today has very little ring here in American culture. So I didn't realize that at all first when I started collecting Sir Charles Thompson records. I thought somehow this guy got knighted. That was my honest first impression. I'm like, this guy must have played for the Queen. And I had an audience with her. Rest in peace, Miss Elizabeth. She was Queen for my whole lifetime. And being Canadian, the Queen has some relevancy, not politically, but more socially and historically. My mom was more connected to the crown, of course, than her children are. But anyway, Sir Charles Thompson, great stuff. Early in the Vanguard series, I think it's 8003. Correct, 8003. And there's about 20 10 inches on Vanguard before they roll over into their LP series. And I'm slowly collecting them. There's some great titles in there, actually. Vanguard's jazz imprint probably is most important in this early 50s era. By the late 60s, it's kind of more peripheral, and Vanguard starts branching off into other sounds as well, including some rock and roll. Another little label that I feel is kind of a budget label is the Royale label. And there's some great Don Byas, and there's some great Ellington stuff, and this is Jazz Greats featuring tenor saxman with Charlie Ventura and Coleman Hawkins. And I got it for a few dollars. Ben Webster is on here, and it's almost certainly taken from 78s. So what was partly happening in this era, the early 50s, was the 10-inch era was dawning. The 33 1/3 speed was the new format. The LP era was shortly to dawn upon us again, causing everyone to change their turntables. The 10-inch would fit on the old 78 RPM decks. So that's why they went to the 10-inch initially. It was the slower speed, more music on it, but it would still fit on your deck. You would just have to change your needle. And then they expanded it to the 12-inch to make them even longer, making all the old turntables essentially obsolete. You had to have a second new turntable now to play the new 12 inches, and you had to keep your old player to play your 10 inches and 78s. Of course, the 10 inches would probably play on both. But it was an interesting bridge, the 10-inch. It's a fascinating little period in the music industry, and jazz is a big part of that in that moment. So again, being that it's 78 stuff, it's probably going to be from the 40s. I'm guessing it is from the 40s. There's not much information on the back on these. But there's some good stuff on this little label. I'm guessing it was budget reissues of 78 stuff that would sit in record stores for 99 cents. It says 69 cents right there. Could that possibly be an original sticker? Hard to say. I doubt it. But, so again, I've been enjoying collecting these little 10 inches. It's a fun aspect of jazz. And, one of the labels that I've kind of dove into recently, and it's something I'm slowly collecting, and I haven't had the time and the money to really collect jazz vinyl these last few months. The coffee shop has been very demanding, a lot of time, and I mean, if you're going to do it, you got to do it right. And so it's not me complaining, it's just me, and I don't have the money really to be buying a bunch of jazz records right now either. It's just not part of my budget when I'm putting together the coffee shop details. But I discovered a label that I had come across over the years. And mostly how I collect the smaller labels is the artists I get into on the bigger labels. Most of them have a few things on these small, in between the crack labels that I kind of ignored when I was filling in my Riversides and my Savoys and my Atlantics and my Blue Notes and my Riversides, my Prestiges, my Contemporaries, my Pacifics, my VJs, my Argos, my Emercies. I was filling in all that discography. And all the time you're branching and broadening out your knowledge of different artists. But then as you get those labels completed, you look at the artist's discographies, like Kenny Dorham, for example. You see he's got a couple records on Time. You see he's got a record on United Artists. You see he's got a record on Candid. So Mingus brings you to Candid in Bethlehem. Johnny Hartman brought me to Bethlehem. And so different artists will bring you to small little labels. And then certain little labels you'll see pop up enough that you start going, oh, I should probably just learn more about Bethlehem and not have all 200 of them. The same thing goes for almost all those little labels where I have these cabinets filled with different labels. Discovery was one I'd seen over the years numerous times, and the level of interest I have in the artists will sometimes predicate how quickly I dive into certain labels. And Discovery had some interesting titles, but I always kind of ignored them. The two biggest ones on this label are two Art Pepper 10 inches, and they're not cheap. Those Art Pepper 10 inches. And one of the things I've interestingly found out is the deeper I dive into some of this stuff, the more often I can't find resources to validate or cross-reference what I'm gleaning. For example, there's some stuff here on Discovery, including those two Art Pepper 10 inches, that turns out I already have that music because Savoy bought the licensing or rights to part of their discography and reissued it. Discovery is like Trend and like Storyville and like a number of the label Progressive. It's one of those labels that existed for a short time in the 50s. Goes under, but then resurfaces as traditional jazz kind of resurfaces in the late 70s and 80s. They re-bring some of those label imprints back as separate business entities. They're not the same thing. There's decades in between their discography runs. Storyville has a great little run in Boston of about 40, 10 inches and 12 inches, disappears for 20 years, and comes back in Denmark. So there's a lot of that happening in the later era, and I think this is Discovery's a label that also has that happening, where you have a bunch of Discovery titles that come much later than their early 10-inch material. And so as I was diving into this Discovery collection, I think I have 10 of them now. There's an earlier 2000 series, which seems to be mostly licensing UK jazz and issuing it in America on Discovery. And I haven't bought none of that stuff yet. I found a few of them. I'm watching a couple, but again, my money's not super fluid right now, so I haven't got to those yet. But I've been diving into the 3000 series, which are 10 inches, from the early 50s into, of course, 54 or 55 when they switched to LP. And the first one I got here was this Calvin Jackson, who, if I remember, is a great piano player. And he's a black guy, which this label's not filled with very many black titles. But it's great to see that they were doing both. And Discovery starts in Hollywood, but then they branch out to New York. And whether they coexisted in both, I think they did. And you see, this one says Hollywood, California. If you can see that. But some of them also say New York. And so whether or not there's a chronology that's evident in that information, I think there probably is, but I'm not sure. I mean, if I see a New York and a Hollywood, is Hollywood always going to be older? Or is there just, they did them in both places for most of the time? Anyway, Calvin Jackson, I haven't even listened to it yet. Cool cover. I think Burt Goldblatt actually does a couple things on Discovery, but I don't think he does this one. Someone initialed CK, so. But anyway, it's a cool little jazzy design. It reminds me a little bit of a couple of those Herbie Nichols Blue Note 10 inches, a little less colorful. That was 3001. That was the first in that new series of what I think is kind of more original material. I think in the 2000 series was kind of all stuff they licensed from European recordings. And I think we start diving now into more original recordings by them. This is number 3002, George Shearing. Again, a great British player. And then an interesting cover as well. I mean, what's happening there? It's kind of strange little characters. This is 3002, Discovery. Shearing's a great player. And I'm going to mention right now, there's a song here called Midnight on Cloud 69. And I'll show you why that's relevant shortly. Number 3007. is That's Auld by the great Georgie Auld and his orchestra. And Georgie Auld's actually from my hometown of Toronto, Canada. One of the great early Canadian jazz greats, honestly. He's kind of forgotten today, but he's obviously a white cat. A great player. I love some of his records on Decca. They're beautiful, melancholic sax yearning. I mean, if you like saxophone yearning, Georgie Auld in the right setting can kill you. And he also played with one of the great swing bands, whether it was Goodman or Artie Shaw. He plays with someone of pretty great importance. I've read about it back in the day. It's been a while, and my mind's filled with coffee shop stuff right now. So I noticed there's some memory slippage happening. 50 is a fun moment for that. But again, Georgie Auld, 3007. You can find this for $10. You know what I mean? Not super expensive. But a great player, all the same. And then there's a great Paul Smith. And Paul Smith plays with Ella Fitzgerald. He's got some other great recordings on Capitol, on Savoy. And this is a similar cover as the last one. It's got the little Greek-looking flute player in the background there. There's different versions of these 10 inches with different covers where they take that little guy in the background out, actually. But Paul Smith, a great piano player and a very underrated, forgotten player in today's consumer market. Then there's the great Martha Raye, who's a singer I'm a pretty big fan of, 3010. And what a cool cover. Great eyebrows, beautiful eyes, nice lips. I haven't listened to it yet. I just got it. I think I have her on Jubilee as well, if I remember. Cool cover. Again, this is pre-Reed Miles at Blue Note, so there's some of that here. I don't see who designed it graphically. So anyway, beautiful. I'm looking forward to listening to this one. I mean, she's on the poppier side of the jazz canon, but I still enjoy her. And then Marianne McCall is another great singer who I have on Jubilee. She has a great record, I think, on Savoy, if I remember. Marianne McCall, I have her with Charlie Ventura on Verve. So she shows up in numerous places. I think she was singing with Woody Herman for a while, and then kind of gets some grift on her own. She gets her own little thing going. And I think this is just a fantastic design. I think this is beautiful. I really, really like that cover. It reminds me of the era of my childhood, my grandparents' basement, just what you would see in catalogs and magazines, and it just has this chic urbanity of the post-war world with modernity and just shapes and colors and lines. I just love it. I think it's fantastic design. It makes me want to put it out and display it. Everything about it. Again, she's a great singer. There's a picture of her. Again, with jazz singers, you're kind of at the mercy of the production and the band behind them. You put some of these singers like a Teddy King with a great jazz band, it's going to be a fantastic session. You put her with a schmaltzy orchestra, and you're going to get something a lot schmaltzier. Then there's a great Dizzy Gillespie, which is one of the things I've always kind of wanted on this label. This is 3013. It's got Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, Lullaby the Leaves, Alone Together. Some fantastic pictures on the back here. A really cool cover. This is 3013. Again, just fantastic stuff. Johnny Richards conducts, who was a really interesting, innovative producer, conductor and arranger, more so than a producer at this time. And his arrangements were kind of sought after at this moment. But again, some of these song titles were ringing a bell with me. And then, once again, Eddie Burt, who was winning Trombone Player of the Year awards in the early 50s. It shows up on the scene. And he's just a dynamic player. Fantastic tonality, great virtuosity, with some blues edge and some soul to him. He's a white guy, but Eddie Burt can play. But looking into the Art Pepper 10 inches, which I wanted, and I still want eventually, I started to realize that, what is going on here? These song titles ring a bell to me. And I had to realize that Surf Ride on Savoy number 12,089, which I knew was from earlier dates, is the two Discovery 10 inches. And that's kind of when the dominoes started falling. And I was like, oh, wait a second. Eddie Burt, he has stuff on Savoy. He sure does. And I have both of Eddie Burt's Savoy albums. Marianne McCall, I think, has a record on Savoy, if I remember. I get her confused with a couple other gals. Dizzy Gillespie, this is on Savoy. And then I realized as I dug deeper, the Paul Smith stuff, there's Savoy Paul Smith stuff that came from an earlier time. There's a Georgie Alt Savoy that never actually got issued, that was planned on being issued. There's a George Shearing on Savoy. And so as I started putting all that together, I was like, wait a second. The Surf Ride, that's the Art Pepper. Oh man, this Paul Smith stuff, that's probably Discovery stuff too. And it turns out, George Shearing, right here, Midnight. This record's called Midnight on Cloud 69. And that's obviously the song from the Discovery 10-inch. Dixieland, Ben Pollock and his Pick-a-Rib Boys. It's a name that sticks out, Pick-a-Rib Boys. There's a Ben Pollock 10-inch at Discovery. I was like, oh. The Red Norvo Trio with Tal Farlow and Charlie Mingus. This is Discovery stuff. So the Paul Smith, the Dizzy Gillespie, potentially the Eddie Burt, the Pick-a-Rib Boys, the George Shearing, the Art Pepper stuff. It's a whole series of Discovery titles that Savoy bought and reissued, like they did with the Signal stuff and like they did with a few other labels over the years. And Discogs hasn't made that connection yet. None of those Discovery 10 inches, when you view all releases of it, has made that leap that connects the Art Pepper 10 inches on Discovery to the Surf Ride on Savoy. Which is something I think maybe I should go in there and edit that, but it takes quite a bit of collecting labels to start seeing. And this has happened to me numerous times where I'm seeing things in these discographies that Discogs hasn't made that connection yet. I'm like, oh, that's crazy. So I think Savoy's one of the labels that there's hidden discoveries to be made yet. Blue Note's so magnified. I've identified the Blue Note story, and the Blue Note story is actually quite finite. Alfred's in charge of most of that stuff. There's a few exceptions, but Alfred's kind of in control of most of those sessions. Savoy was a label that didn't mind. Bethlehem was a label that didn't mind. There was Bethlehem stuff that was licensed from Period that Discogs hadn't connected. And so someday maybe when I have the time, I'll go into Discogs and try to edit some of that stuff. But it's just weird when your research into something goes ahead of the resources that you use to research. And it's just, you just kind of I probably should have connected it sooner. I'm not patting myself on the back here. It's just, I'm like, oh, that's all connected. Last thing I want to talk about today is a small label out of Boston, Transition. And Transition has some great titles with Donald Byrd. And that's mostly what they're known for. It's a great Doug Watkins record, a Herb Pomeroy record. Transition was Tom Wilson, if I remember, who ends up being a fairly prominent rock and roll producer. But Wilson starts Transition as a label in Boston that has a lot of great hard bop on it. Dizzy Reese recorded for Transition. The Blue Note ends up issuing that. And if you buy the Japanese version of that, those Transition, Doug Watkins does those Transition, Dizzy Reese, they'll actually come with Blue Note labels on the inside. Even though they were, it's interesting how it's a Transition record. It probably should have a Transition label, but the Japanese, they do a great job in almost every facet, so we'll forgive them that. The Transition label I haven't completed. They're pretty rare records. The stuff outside of what I just mentioned is kind of fairly obscure. There's a few other titles in there I would like to get. I think there's a Cecil Taylor, if I remember, early Cecil Taylor, before he goes off the wall. But one of the records I always wanted from Transition, never was able to find, was something they licensed actually from France. I think on the Vogue label, if I remember, maybe Disc. I think it was Vogue. It was a Lucky Thompson session. And Lucky Thompson slips over to Europe in the probably late 40s and kind of slips into obscurity here, sadly. But Lucky's a great player with a beautiful tonality. He comes back to America in the mid-'60s, does some great stuff for Prestige. I love the Lucky Thompson stuff I've come across, that Dawn session, which I also think is a UK session that Dawn licensed here. I find Lucky to be one of the great lyricists and actually a great bridge between the swing and the bebop era. And he's kind of like Dexter Gordon in that sense. They both have some Coleman Hawkins and Ben Webster in them. The lineage in the saxophone is very concise. It's not like you can... trumpets have a lot of different kind of lineages in a way. The tenor sax lineage is fairly... it's hard to not have Coleman Hawkins in you when you play the tenor as a jazz player. So I finally found Lucky Strikes, Lucky Thompson Big Band Transition, number 21. Cool old cover. Annoyingly, their backs are often like this, and there was an insert inside that had some of the information, which sadly this one is missing. And honestly, it's also missing its middle labels, which a lot of transitions have that issue. Their glue wasn't great. And I've had to re-glue several transition LPs. I'm trying to think there's another label I have that same issue with. What label is it? There's specific labels, though, where this is an issue. Like Emerson had the covers like separated. Certain labels didn't use great glue on their record labels. But I haven't listened to it yet. I just got it in the mail yesterday. It's missing. It's, like I said, it's labels. The vinyl looks to be VG plus, I would say. I mean, there's a few hairline things there that I can't feel at all. Cool cover. There's a little bit of writing on it. But those flaws allowed me to get a record that goes for $400 or $500 for $30. And that's kind of how you have to operate in today's jazz vintage collecting. If you're in the reissue game, you don't have to worry about some of that stuff. So a lot of my advice on that stuff has no meaning to you guys. But if you're collecting vintage stuff, sometimes you just have to be patient and not spend the big bucks. Wait for something to come along that has a few minor flaws that you can live with. And each person has their own parameters in terms of that. But for me, this was a great score. And I initially hesitated when it popped up in my Discogs wanted notifications. I was like, oh, $30. And then I saw the flaws. But I thought about it for 2 days. I've been watching for this for 2 years on Discogs. Never seen one come up for less than probably $300-$400. And a lot of those are in Europe, sadly, which means you're going to pay a big shipping cost on top of the price. So I've always kind of passed, and I finally added this to my collection. A beautiful transition original. Again, not pristine, but still a fine addition to the Jazz Shepherd's flock. So that's today's episode on discovery and the discovery that goes with that discovery. It's an interesting little thing. Congratulations to Aaron Judge, by the way. He hit his 61st home run yesterday, which is the anniversary of Roger Maris hitting his 61 in 1961, which just happens to be 61 years ago. If that's not some crazy baseball symmetry. Baseball's always been in the game about the numbers. But the fact that Aaron Judge hits his 61st 61 years later from Roger Maris's record in the year 1961. I mean, Maris hitting 61 and 61 was significant. But the fact that it's been equaled in the American League now 61 years later by the great Aaron Judge, congratulations to him. I'm not a Yankee fan, I'm a Blue Jay fan from Toronto. But you always have to respect the Yankee legacy and story. The history of baseball is wrapped around Yankee stories. It's the only team that's relevant in every decade of baseball's history, save the first 10 years of the American League. And, of course, they didn't exist in the 1800s like some of the National League clubs do. But for pretty much from 1920 to the present, the Yankees are the baseball headliners. And so their stories always are relevant. Every decade they're relevant. So that means Yankee fans are the most knowledgeable fans in baseball because their announcers and commentators are telling you stories from every decade of the game. So you know, and every era is relevant to your knowledge. Whereas, St. Louis is probably second, the Red Sox, Boston are probably third. And then if you're like on the West Coast, your baseball history is 40, 50 years sometimes. 60 years if you're LA or Frisco. Anyway, so congrats, Aaron Judge. Appreciate you guys all. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. And if you want to support the channel and the coffee shop and the jazz museum that we're going to kind of put in here, feel free to go to my Patreon page and subscribe and pledge a few dollars a month. It all helps. We appreciate you all. You all be safe. Have a great day. We'll talk to you soon. Peace.